Millionaire woman hires homeless black man as a butler, but when he appears, she falls in love. Offering an opportunity to a man in need, she doesn't expect the profound impact he'll have on her life. Their connection deepens, leading to complications neither anticipated. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Brooks mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Samantha Brooks sat in her father's study, surrounded by the trappings of generational wealth. Antique furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and shelves lined with leather-bound books. At 32, she had achieved everything her family had planned for her. An MBA from Harvard, a position on the board of Brooks Industries, and a social circle filled with America's elite. Yet, she felt empty. The mansion's size only emphasized her solitude. Since her personal assistant quit 3 months ago, the daily tasks had become overwhelming. It wasn't about the work itself. Samantha could handle schedules and arrangements. It was the crushing weight of maintaining appearances, of being a Brooks in every moment of every day. She opened her laptop and began reviewing applications for a new household manager. The position had been open for weeks, but none of the candidates seemed right. They were either too eager to please or too impressed by the family name. Samantha needed someone who could see past the Brooks facade. The next interview was scheduled for 2 p.m. Malik Johnson's resume stood out, not because of its prestigious positions, but because of its honesty. He had started as a housekeeping staff at a hotel chain, worked his way up to guest services, and then moved into private service. No elaborate embellishments, just a clear progression of someone who understood hard work. At exactly 2 p.m., Malik arrived. He wore a well-fitted dark suit, nothing flashy but impeccably maintained. Samantha noticed his straight posture, the confident but not arrogant way he carried himself. He was younger than she expected, probably in his mid-30s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Please have a seat, Mr. Johnson," Samantha gestured to the chair across from her desk. The interview started formally enough. Malik answered questions about his experience with precision and clarity. But it was his response to her question about handling difficult situations that caught her attention. "Ms. Brooks, in my experience, the most challenging situations aren't about logistics or scheduling. They're about understanding people. Everyone, regardless of their position or background, needs to feel heard and respected." Something in his voice, in the way he maintained eye contact without being intimidating, made Samantha lean forward. For the first time in months, she felt like someone was seeing her, not just the Brooks name. The interview extended beyond the scheduled time. They discussed everything from household management to their favorite books. Malik's knowledge surprised her. He could quote Shakespeare and discuss modern architecture with equal ease. "The position is yours if you want it," Samantha said finally, surprising herself with the quick decision. Malik accepted with a gracious nod, and they arranged for him to start the following Monday. As he left the mansion, Samantha watched from the window, feeling oddly lighter than she had in years. But outside the gates, Malik's composed demeanor shifted slightly. A man emerged from the shadows of a nearby tree. Marcus, his childhood friend from the streets. Marcus's presence was a stark reminder of a life Malik had worked hard to leave behind. "Look at you, man," Marcus said, his tone a mixture of pride and something darker. "All suited up for the rich folks." Malik straightened his tie, a gesture that felt like armor. "It's just a job, ma. Or cuss. Is it? Those people up there, they'll never see you as one of them, no matter how many fancy suits you wear." The words hit their mark, stirring doubts Malik thought he'd buried. He'd worked hard to build his career, to move beyond his past. But standing there, with Marcus's words hanging in the air and the Brooks mansion looming behind him, Malik felt the weight of two worlds pulling him in opposite directions. He watched Marcus walk away, then turned to look back at the mansion. Through one of the windows, he could see Samantha still at her desk, probably reviewing his paperwork. The connection he'd felt during the interview was real, but so was the gulf between their worlds. As he walked to his car, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this position would change his life in ways he couldn't predict. The first few weeks at the Brooks mansion settled into a comfortable rhythm. Malik moved through the house with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs before they arose. But it was the moments between tasks that began to shift the dynamic between him and Samantha. One evening, after a particularly stressful board meeting, Samantha found herself in the kitchen, where Malik was preparing her usual evening tea. She sat at the marble counter, watching him work. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for any of this," she said, surprising herself with the admission. The company, the social obligations, the constant pressure to be perfect. She gestured vaguely at the grandeur surrounding them. Malik placed the tea in front of her, the porcelain cup clicking softly against its saucer. "Perfection is overrated," he said, his voice steady. "It's authenticity that matters." "Try telling that to my mother," Samantha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything in her world needs to be just so. The right schools, the right friends, the right marriage prospects." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of it all." Malik was quiet for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "I understand more than you might think," he said finally. "Different circumstances, but the same weight of expectations." Something in his tone made Samantha look up. In that moment, Malik seemed to make a decision. He pulled out a chair and sat down, something he'd never done before. "I lost my family when I was 16, he began. "A fire in our apartment building. My younger brother and I made it out, but our parents didn't. After that, life became about survival. The streets taught me how to be invisible when needed and commanding when necessary. Every day was about meeting expectations, not of high society, but of survival." Samantha listened, her tea forgotten. She'd read his references, his employment history, but nothing had hinted at this past. Their moment of connection was interrupted by the sound of car doors closing outside. "That'll be your mother and sister for dinner," Malik said, standing smoothly. The professional mask slipped back into place, but something had shifted between them. The dining room filled with the usual dinner party sounds: crystal clinking, silverware against fine china, and Elizabeth Brooks's carefully modulated voice directing the conversation. Samantha's mother sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her criticism constant. "Darling, the table settings are different tonight," Elizabeth noted, her tone suggesting this was an unforgivable sin. "I thought we always used the Wedgwood for family dinners." "Malik suggested we try the Limoges set," Samantha replied. "I think it works better with a new centerpiece." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed at the mention of Malik's name. "The help shouldn't be making these decisions, Samantha. Really, I don't understand why you insisted on hiring him. There were plenty of more suitable candidates." The emphasis on suitable made Samantha's stomach turn. She watched as Malik entered the room to refill water glasses, his face professionally neutral despite surely having heard every word. "Mother, Malik is exceptionally qualified," Samantha said, her voice tight. "He's transformed the household management in just a few weeks." "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Elizabeth snapped. She turned to Malik, who was still serving water. "No offense intended, of course." "None taken, Mrs. Brooks," Malik replied smoothly, but Samantha saw the slight tension in his shoulders. After dinner, Samantha found Malik in the kitchen, methodically loading the dishwasher, a task he insisted on doing himself despite their other staff. "I'm sorry about my mother," she said, leaning against the counter. "You don't need to apologize for her," he replied, not looking up from his task. "I've dealt with worse." "That doesn't make it right." Samantha moved closer, noticing how he paused briefly in his movements. "What you shared with me earlier. Thank you. It couldn't have been easy." Malik finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "Nothing worth doing ever is," he said softly. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. But then Malik straightened, adjusting his jacket. "Will you need anything else this evening, Ms. Brooks?" The return to formality felt like a door closing, but Samantha understood. They both had roles to play, expectations to meet. Yet as she watched him finish his tasks for the evening, she couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had changed. The careful boundaries between employer and employee had begun to blur, and neither of them was quite sure what that meant. The invitation to the annual Brooks Foundation Gala sat on Samantha's desk like a gleaming challenge. Every year, it was the same routine: She'd attend alone, endure countless introductions to suitable bachelors her mother had selected, and maintain the perfect Brooks family image. This year would be different. She found Malik in the library, organizing the rare book collection her father prided himself on, but never read. "I'd like you to accompany me to the gala," she said without preamble. Malik's hands stilled on the leather spine he was cleaning. "As staff, you mean?" "As my guest." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Malik carefully placed the book back on its shelf before turning to face her. "Samantha," he said, dropping formality for the first time, "you know that's not a good idea." "Why not?" She moved closer, challenging him. "Because of what people might think? Because of my mother." "Because it could hurt you," he replied simply. "Your world is rules, unspoken but rigid. Breaking them has consequences. I'm tired of rules. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not." Samantha's voice was firm, but her hands trembled slightly. "Will you come?" Malik studied her face for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said, "but not because I think it's wise." The night of the gala arrived with all its usual pomp. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and old money. Samantha chose a deep blue gown that made her feel brave, while Malik wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that transformed him from staff to sophisticate. They arrived separately, a small concession to propriety. Samantha entered first, playing her usual role of gracious heiress. When Malik arrived 20 minutes later, the subtle shift in the room's energy was immediate. Elizabeth Brooks's face tightened when she saw him, her champagne glass freezing halfway to her lips. Several of the foundation's board members exchanged meaningful glances, but it was the younger crowd's reaction that surprised Samantha most. Curious looks, raised eyebrows, and whispered conversations that seemed more intrigued than scandalized. Malik navigated the room with natural grace, his background in service giving him an advantage in reading people and situations. He spoke intelligently about art with a museum curator, discussed international markets with a hedge fund manager, and charmed several of the older patrons with his knowledge of classical music. Yet Samantha couldn't ignore the undercurrent of judgment. She caught snippets of conversations. "Isn't that her butler? The Brooks girl has always been different. Elizabeth must be mortified." During a lull in the evening, Samantha found herself at the bar next to Regina Whitmore, her mother's oldest friend. "Darling," Regina said, her voice dripping with false concern, "is this some sort of statement you're making?" Samantha watched Malik across the room, noting how he maintained perfect posture despite the pressure. "The only statement I'm making is that I choose my own company." "But dear, you must think of your position, your family's reputation." Regina's voice lowered. "There are appropriate ways to handle these sorts of attractions." The suggestion made Samantha's skin crawl. She set down her untouched champagne with careful precision. "I don't need to handle anything, Regina. Malik is here as my guest, nothing more or less." But even as she said it, she felt the electric awareness between them across the crowded room. When their eyes met briefly, she saw his concern, not for himself, but for her. He'd known this would happen, had tried to warn her. Later, during a slow dance that they both knew was pushing boundaries too far, Malik spoke softly near her ear. "We can leave if you want. You've made your point." "Have I?" Samantha asked, aware of every eye on them, every whispered comment. "What point is that? That you're your own person, that you won't be controlled." His hand was proper on her waist, but she could feel its warmth through the silk of her dress. But at what cost? The question hung between them as the music ended. Samantha saw her mother approaching with thunderous determination, flanked by two board members. The confrontation was inevitable. "Perhaps," Malik said, stepping back, "some battles aren't worth the war they start." But as he turned to leave the dance floor, Samantha caught his hand. In that touch was everything they hadn't said about class, about race, about the worlds they came from and the space between them. The pressure of judging eyes felt overwhelming, but his hand in hers felt right. The evening ended with no open confrontations, but plenty of subtle damage done. As they left separately, another concession to appearance, Samantha couldn't decide if she felt triumphant or terrified. She'd challenged the status quo, but at what cost to them both? The day after the gala, Malik arrived at work earlier than usual. He found Samantha in the garden, still in her robe, staring at her phone. From her expression, he could tell the social fallout had begun. "The society pages are having a field day," she said without looking up. Brooks' heiress's shocking display. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore." Malik remained standing, maintaining professional distance. "Ms. Brooks, Samantha, we need to talk about last night." She finally looked at him, noting his formal stance. "If you're going to quit, just say it." "I'm not quitting," he said, his voice careful. "But I need you to understand what you're risking. Your family, your position, your inheritance. These aren't small things to throw away." "For what?" "For you." Samantha stood, challenging him. "Is that what you think this is about? Isn't it?" His composure cracked slightly. "I've spent my life understanding boundaries, Samantha. The world I came from, the worlds I've worked in, they all have lines you don't cross. Last night, we crossed several." Before she could respond, her phone rang. The screen displayed "Father." Samantha's face paled, but she answered, putting it on speaker. "The board meeting has been moved up." Her father's voice was clipped. "And your attendance is mandatory. We need to discuss your recent choices." After the call ended, Samantha sat heavily on a garden bench. "They're gonna try to force me out? Mother's been pushing for it ever since I refused to marry James Whitmore last year. This will give them the leverage they need." Malik finally sat beside her, professional distance forgotten. "Then maybe we should step back. Give them time to know." Her voice was firm. "I'm tired of living my life according to their rules." The garden's peace was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, Malik's friend from the streets. He stood at the garden gate, looking out of place among the manicured roses. "Need to talk to you, brother," Marcus called out, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. Malik hesitated, torn between his current reality and his past. "I should handle this," he said to Samantha, standing quickly. At the gate, Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're all over the morning news, man. Mystery man at Brooks' gala. They're going to start digging." "Let them dig," Malik replied, but his jaw tightened. "They'll find out about the gang, about what happened after the fire." Marcus lowered his voice. "About what we did to survive." The threat of his past being exposed hung heavy in the air. Malik had worked hard to build a new life, to become someone worthy of trust and respect. One news cycle could destroy it all. "You think she'll still look at you the same way when she knows everything?" Marcus pressed. "These rich folks, they play at being understanding until reality hits too close to home." Malik watched Samantha through the garden gate, still sitting on the bench, her face troubled as she read more messages on her phone. The morning sun caught her hair, and for a moment, the distance between their worlds seemed insurmountable. "She's different," Malik said, but doubt crept into his voice. "They're never different," Marcus scoffed. "Wake up, man. You're just a project to her. Something to rebel against her family with." The words hit harder than Malik wanted to admit. He'd seen it before in other houses where he'd worked. The temporary fascination of the wealthy with those they saw as different, exotic. But with Samantha, it had felt real. Still felt real. Inside the mansion, the phone rang again. This time, Malik could see it was Samantha's father's lawyer. The reality of their situation pressed in from all sides. "Just think about what you're doing," Marcus said, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Some doors, once you open them, you can't close again." As Marcus walked away, Malik returned to find Samantha ending another call, her face set in determination. "That was Richard, our family lawyer," she said. "Apparently, my father is preparing to invoke the moral clause in my trust fund agreement. They're really going to try to cut me off." Malik stood at a careful distance. "Then maybe we should—" "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't say we should stop whatever this is. That's exactly what they want." But Malik could see the cost in her face, in the tension around her eyes. He thought about Marcus's words about his past, about all the things Samantha didn't know. The weight of it all threatened to crush him. "I should give my notice," he said quietly. "Is that what you want?" Samantha stood, moving closer. "What I want stopped mattering a long time ago," he replied. "What matters is not destroying everything you've worked for." The space between them filled with unspoken words and impossible choices. The morning sun continued to rise over the garden, indifferent to the lives it illuminated. The address was scribbled on a piece of paper Samantha had found in Malik's employee file. Riverside District, a part of the city she'd only seen from the safety of her car windows. Today, she parked her Mercedes several blocks away and walked, trying to blend in despite her designer coat and boots. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to her world of manicured lawns and security gates. Here, buildings wore their age openly, paint peeling, steps crumbling, but there was life everywhere. Go! Ildren played basketball with a milk crate nailed to a telephone pole. Old men sat on stoops, watching the world pass by. Music drifted from open windows, a mix of genres and languages creating an urban symphony. Following the numbered buildings, she found herself outside a burned-out structure. Yellow caution tape, faded and torn, still clung to parts of the fence. This was it, the building where Malik had lost his family. "You looking for someone?" Samantha turned to find an elderly woman watching her from a neighboring stoop. I'm trying to learn about someone who used to live here," Samantha said, gesturing to the burned building. The woman's eyes narrowed with recognition. "You're that girl from the news, the one with Malik Johnson." Samantha straightened her spine, ready for judgment, but the woman just nodded. "That boy," she said, shaking her head. "Used to watch him and his little brother Marcus running around here. Good kids before the fire. That night changed everything." "Marcus?" Samantha's mind raced. "His friend Marcus is his brother?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Washington, invited Samantha to sit. Over the next hour, she learned more about Malik's past than he'd ever shared. How he worked 3 jobs to keep Marcus in school after their parents died. How he'd sleep in the shelter, but tell everyone he had an apartment. How he'd studied for his GED between shifts at the diner. "But Marcus," Mrs. Washington continued, "that boy took a different path. Started running with the wrong crowd. Malik tried to stop him, but you can't save someone who doesn't want saving." As Samantha walked the neighborhood, each corner seemed to hold a piece of Malik's story. The community center where he'd learned to box to protect himself. The library where he'd spent hours teaching himself proper English and etiquette. The diner where he'd first learned to serve others. She stopped at that diner, now under new management. The vinyl booths were cracked, the linoleum floor worn, but there was dignity in its resilience. Sitting there, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, Samantha began to understand the depth of what Malik had overcome. A group of teenagers entered, loud and boisterous. One of them looked so much like a young Malik that Samantha's heart clenched. She watched them count their change carefully, sharing a plate of fries between 4 people. Without thinking, she called the waitress over and paid for their meals anonymously. It was a small gesture, perhaps even a naive one, but it felt right. Back at the mansion, Malik was polishing silver when she returned. He took one look at her windblown hair, and understanding dawned in his eyes. "You went there?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Why didn't you tell me about Marcus?" she asked softly. "About him being your brother?" Malik set down the silver piece he was working on, his movements deliberate. "Because some things are harder to explain than others. Marcus, he represents everything I tried to leave behind, everything I tried to protect you from." "You don't need to protect me," Samantha said, moving closer. "I saw where you came from today. I met Mrs. Washington. I sat in the diner where you worked, and do you know what I felt? Not pity, not shock, but admiration." "Admiration?" His laugh was bitter. "For what?" "For climbing out of the gutter. For never letting it break you. For building yourself into someone extraordinary despite everything life threw at you." She reached for his hand, ignoring how he stiffened. "The person you are today, the strength, the dignity, the kindness, it all makes so much more sense now." Malik pulled away, conflict clear on his face. "You saw one day of that life, Samantha. One sanitized version. You didn't see the nights in the shelter, the fights, the hunger. You didn't see what Marcus and I had to do to survive. Then tell me," she challenged. "Stop protecting me and tell me the truth." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken histories and fears. Finally, Malik spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some truths change how people see you forever. Are you sure that's what you want? The question hung in the air as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the mansion's windows. Two worlds collided in that moment. Her world of privilege and his world of survival. The distance between them seemed both vast and insignificant. The library had become their sanctuary in the evening hours, after the rest of the staff had gone home. Tonight, Malik stood by the window, his reflection ghost-like against the darkness outside. Samantha waited in silence, giving him space to find his words. The fire started around midnight, he finally began. I was 16, Marcus was 14. We just moved to that building after being evicted from our last place. Dad was working 2 jobs, Mom was sick. The electrical system was faulty. His voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the windowsill. I woke up to smoke. Got Marcus out first. That's what Dad always told me. Take care of your brother. When I went back for our parents, he stopped, swallowing hard. The firefighters held me back. Said the structure was compromised. I watched our parents' window until the flames took everything. Samantha moved closer, but didn't touch him. You were just a child, Malik. A child who suddenly had to be an adult. He turned to face her. The system wanted to separate us. Fostercare. I couldn't let that happen, so we ran. The confession came slowly, each word seeming to cost him something. He told her about the abandoned buildings they slept in, the odd jobs that barely fed them, the nights when Marcus would cry from hunger and Malik would give him his own portion. Then Marcus met some guys who offered quick money. Drug running at first, then more. Malik's voice hardened. I tried to stop him, but I was working so many jobs, I couldn't be there enough. One night, he came home beaten badly. Said he needed money fast, or worse would happen. Samantha could see where this was going. What did you do? What any desperate brother would do. I helped him. Staged a robbery at the store where I worked nights. No one got hurt, but he met her eyes directly. I'm a thief, Samantha. A criminal. That's part of who I am. She processed this, thinking of her own family's history, of great-grandfathers who'd made fortunes through questionable means during Prohibition, of modern-day corporate raids that destroyed small businesses. We all have darkness in our past. It's not the same, he said sharply. Your family's sins are cushioned by wealth and time. Mine could still land me in jail if anyone dug deep enough. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 times. Each sound seemed to emphasize the weight of his confession. Did it end there? She asked quietly. No, but I got smart. Started learning everything I could. Found legitimate work in hotels, learned how to speak, how to carry myself. Created a new identity piece by piece. He laughed without humor. Turns out the skills that helped me survive on the streets, reading people, anticipating needs, staying invisible when necessary, made me excellent at service. Samantha crossed the space between them, taking his hand despite his attempt to pull away. You did what you had to do to survive and protect your brother. Don't romanticize it, he warned. Your mother's right to want me away from you. I'm not who you think I am. You're exactly who I think you are, she countered. Someone who faced impossible choices and still managed to keep his humanity. Someone who turned his life around not just for himself, but to help others. The tension in his shoulders started to ease, but then his phone buzzed. Marcus's name lit up the screen. He's still in that life, isn't he? Samantha asked. That's why he keeps showing up. Malik nodded. He wants me to help him with one last job. Says it as his ticket out. But there's always one more job, one more scheme. Stay, she said suddenly, gripping his hand tighter. Whatever he's planning, whatever my family threatens, stay here with me. The request hung between them, weighted with implications. Malik looked down at their joined hands, her manicured fingers intertwined with his calloused ones. Your family will never accept this, he said softly. They'll cut you off, ostracize you. Everything you've worked for. I don't care about the money, she interrupted. I care about you. The confession seemed to echo in the library's quiet space. Malik stepped closer, his free hand coming up to touch her face. For a moment, all the barriers between them, class, race, history, seemed to dissolve. But then, from somewhere in the house, they heard the front door open. Voices carried, Samantha's mother's distinct tone among them. Reality crashed back in. We can't keep pretending this won't have consequences, Malik said, stepping back. Then let them come, Samantha replied, her chin lifting with determination. We'll face them together. The dining room had never felt more like a battlefield. Elizabeth Brooks sat at the head of the table, her fingers drumming an irritated rhythm on the mahogany surface. Samantha's father, Richard Brooks III, usually absent due to business travel, had flown in specifically for this dinner. Her sister Victoria perched nearby, a slight smirk playing at her lips. This has gone far enough, Elizabeth announced as soon as the first course was served. She didn't even pretend this was a normal family dinner. Your father and I have been patient, Samantha, but after that spectacle at the gala— Patient? Samantha interrupted, her soup spoon clattering against fine china. You've been anything but patient. You've been calling board members, spreading rumors, trying to undermine my position in the company. We're trying to protect you, Richard spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of authority he used in boardrooms. And protect the family name. Do you have any idea what this association is doing to our reputation? In the kitchen, Malik could hear every word. He'd insisted on serving dinner himself tonight, despite Samantha's protests. The other staff had been dismissed early. This wasn't their burden to bear. His name is Malik, Samantha said firmly. And he's done nothing wrong except exist in a way you don't approve of. Victoria's smirk widened. Oh, sister dear, is that what you think? That this is just about appearances? She pulled out her phone, sliding it across the table. You might want to look at what my private investigator found. Samantha's hand trembled as she picked up the phone. Police reports, juvenile records that should have been sealed, newspaper clippings about the store robbery. Did your precious Malik tell you about his criminal past? Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. About the robbery? The gang connections? Stop it. Samantha's voice was low, dangerous. And let's not forget his brother, Victoria continued, clearly enjoying herself. Still quite active in certain criminal circles, I hear. Is that really the kind of family you want to associate with? Malik entered with the main course, his face a mask of professional detachment. The silence that fell was deafening. You can stop serving us, Elizabeth said coldly. In fact, you can clear out your things tonight. Your services are no longer required. Mother! Samantha stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. You have no right. I have every right, Elizabeth cut in. This is my house, and I will not have a criminal serving dinner to my family. Then I'll leave too, Samantha declared. Richard's fist hit the table, making the crystal water glasses jump. You will do no such thing. If you leave this house, you leave everything, your trust fund, your position in the company, your inheritance, everything. Is he worth it? Victoria asked, false sweetness gone. Worth throwing away everything our family has built? Or is this just another one of your rebellions like that art school phase in college? Malik set down the serving tray with careful precision. Ms. Brooks, he said formally, I should go. No. Samantha moved to stand beside him, a gesture that made Elizabeth gasp. I know about the robbery, about Marcus, about all of it. Malik told me himself. He turned his life around, built something meaningful. That's more than I can say for some people in this room who've never had to work for anything in their lives. Victoria's face darkened. Careful, sister. I know things about you too, like what really happened with James Whitmore last year. How you? Enough. Richard thundered. Samantha, this is your last chance. End this, whatever it is, or face the consequences. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Malik stood perfectly still, years of service training warring with the urge to defend himself, to defend Samantha. I believe in redemption, Samantha said finally, her voice steady. In people's capacity to change, to become better. Maybe if this family believed in that too, we wouldn't be so afraid of anything different from our privileged bubble. Very poetic. Elizabeth's voice was ice. But let me be clear. If you continue this relationship, you'll never work in any company worth mentioning. I'll make sure of it. Is that what you want? To throw away your education, your future? Malik couldn't stay silent any longer. I should go, he repeated, this time moving toward the door. I won't be the reason you lose everything. But Samantha caught his arm. You're not the reason, she said firmly. Their prejudice is the reason. Their fear of anything they can't control is the reason. The dining room fell silent except for the quiet ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, counting down moments in a battle that would change everything. After the disastrous family dinner, Malik moved out of the servants' quarters that night. Despite Samantha's protests, they agreed to take time apart. Not an ending, they told each other, but a pause to reflect. The mansion felt emptier than ever. Samantha threw herself into work, but not the kind her family expected. Instead of attending board meetings, she began volunteering at a community center in Riverside District, the same one where Malik had once learned to box. The irony wasn't lost on her. "You're holding those mitts wrong," a teenage girl told her one afternoon. "You'll hurt your wrist that way." Samantha adjusted her grip, watching the girl throw combinations. These kids reminded her of the stories Malik had told her, about fighting to survive, about finding strength in unlikely places. She learned their names, their dreams, their struggles. Jeremy, who wanted to be a doctor but couldn't afford the prep courses. Maria, who danced ballet in worn-out sneakers because proper shoes were too expensive. Meanwhile, across town, Malik had taken a temporary position managing a hotel. The work was familiar, safe. No complicated emotions, no class divisions to navigate. Just the straightforward exchange of service for payment. But Marcus kept showing up. "Look at you," he said, finding Malik in the hotel's back office. "Back to pushing papers and saying yes, sir, to rich folks. This what you want?" Malik continued reviewing staff schedules. "What I want is for you to get out of this life before it kills you. I got a plan for that." Marcus leaned forward. "One job, big score, enough to start fresh somewhere else." "There's always one more job," Malik said tiredly. "This is different. Remember James Whitmore?" Marcus's eyes gleamed. "Guy's got a gambling problem. Owes the wrong people money. He's desperate enough to help us get into his daddy's investment firm after hours. Clean out some accounts. Make it look like he did it himself." Malik's head snapped up. "James Whitmore? Victoria bro. Okay's his source?" "Two birds, one stone," Marcus grinned. "We get paid, and your girl's family gets some scandal of their own to deal with. Everybody wins. Except the innocent people whose accounts get drained," Malik stood. "I'm not doing it, Marcus. And neither should you." "Man, what happened to you?" Marcus's voice turned bitter. "That girl really got in your head, huh? Making you forget where you came from." "She helped me remember who I always wanted to be," Malik corrected. "The person our parents raised us to be." Back at the community center, Samantha was organizing a fundraiser when her sister Victoria appeared in the doorway. "Slumming it, I see," Victoria observed, looking around with distaste. "What do you want?" "To warn you." Victoria stepped closer. "James Whitmore's been asking questions about Malik. About his brother's connections. Whatever's going on, it's going to get ugly." Samantha felt her chest tighten. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. You think you're living some romantic story about love crossing boundaries? Wake up, Samantha. The real world isn't that simple." After Victoria left, Samantha sat alone in the center's office, surrounded by grant applications and program schedules. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls from her father, probably about missed board meetings. Her trust fund had been frozen, a temporary measure, they called it. She opened her contacts, hovering over Malik's number. They'd agreed on space, on time to think. But all this thinking was leading her in circles. Across town, Malik sat in his sparse apartment, holding a worn photo of his family, his parents smiling, him and Marcus young and innocent. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Last chance, brother. You in or out?" Both Malik and Samantha stared at their phones, feeling the weight of decisions that would change everything. The space between them, meant to bring clarity, had only confirmed what they already knew. Sometimes the hardest choices are the simplest ones. The Brooks Foundation annual charity gala had always been her mother's domain, but Samantha had different plans this year. She rented the venue herself, using the last of her accessible funds. The Imperial Hotel's grand ballroom would host not just the usual socialites, but also community leaders, educators, and young people from Riverside District. "You're really doing this," Jeremy, one of the teens from the community center, said as he helped set up chairs. He'd be speaking at the event about the center's impact on his life. "We're doing this," Samantha corrected, adjusting a banner that read Building Bridges, the future of community investment. She'd spent weeks preparing, convincing skeptical community leaders to participate, reaching out to progressive board members who might support her vision. News of the alternative gala spread quickly through both social circles. Elizabeth Brooks was hosting her own event the same night at the country club, a direct challenge to her daughter's rebellion. "Half the board is already RSVP'd to your mother's event," Victoria informed her, having shown up uninvited to the ballroom during preparations. "You're committing social suicide. Maybe it's time for society to die a little," Samantha replied, not looking up from her donor list. The guest list revealed the fractures in their social circle. Younger board members, tired of old prejudices, chose Samantha's event. Older conservative members sided with Elizabeth. The media caught wind of the split, dubbing it the Battle of the Brooks Galas. Meanwhile, Malik struggled with his own decision. The invitation sat on his kitchen table, personally delivered by Maria from the community center. His name was printed in elegant script, "Honored speaker." "You have to come," Maria had said. "The kids need to hear your story. How you made it out. How you built a different life." But Marcus's warnings echoed in his mind. James Whitmore had been making moves as King Dangerous questions. The wrong people were getting interested in Malik's past. The night before the gala, Samantha worked late at the community center, finalizing details. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Washington from Riverside. "Malik used to sit right where you are," the older woman said, settling into a chair. "Planning his future, studying for tests. That boy had dreams bigger than this neighborhood, but he never forgot where he came from." Samantha set down her papers. "I haven't heard from him in weeks. Sometimes people need to step back to see things clearly," Mrs. Washington said. "But stepping back isn't the same as walking away." The day of the gala arrived with mounting tension. The ballroom transformed into a space where two worlds would collide. Photographs of community center kids hung alongside classical artwork. Catering included both high-end hors d'oeuvres and local family restaurant specialties. An hour before the event, Samantha stood on the empty stage, practicing her speech. The words felt heavy with meaning. "We talk about building bridges, but bridges aren't just structures. They're promises. Promises that we see each other, that we believe in each other's potential, that we're willing to meet halfway." Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Watch out for Whitmore tonight. He's desperate." Then another. "Marcus isn't the only one with dangerous connections." The first guests began arriving. Board members who'd chosen her side, community leaders, kids from the center in borrowed formal wear. Samantha watched from backstage as the worlds mixed awkwardly at first, then with growing warmth. Jeremy gave his speech first, his voice shaking but strong. "Some people look at kids like me and see statistics. Others see potential. The difference changes lives." Then it was Samantha's turn. As she approached the podium, she scanned the crowd. Her mother's absence was expected, but she searched for another face, one she wasn't sure would come. At the back of the ballroom, doors opened. Conversations hushed. Malik stood in the entrance, perfectly dressed in a tuxedo, his presence commanding attention. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded away. But before he could take a step forward, James Whitmore appeared behind him, looking desperate and dangerous. The evening was about to take an unexpected turn. The ballroom fell silent as James Whitmore stumbled forward, his usual polished appearance disheveled. His eyes darted frantically between Malik and Samantha, years of privilege crumbling under desperation. "You think you're so perfect, don't you?" James called out, his voice echoing through the shocked silence. "The noble heiress and her reformed criminal. Let's tell them the truth." Security moved forward, but Samantha raised her hand to stop them. From her position on stage, she could see Marcus slip in through a side door, tension visible in his stance. "The truth about what, James?" Samantha's voice remained steady. "About how your precious Malik and his brother have been planning to rob my father's firm. About how they've been using you to get inside information." James pulled out his phone. "I have proof. Messages, plans, everything." Malik stepped forward, his movements careful. "Those messages were between you and Marcus. You reached out to him, James. You needed money to cover your gambling debts. The crowd murmured. Several board members moved closer, listening intently. That's not. James started, but Marcus cut him off, moving into the light. Show them the rest of the messages, James, Marcus challenged. The ones where you begged me to help you stage a robbery. How you wanted to make it look like an inside job, so you could claim insurance money. Victoria Brooks pushed through the crowd. James, stop talking. Now! But James was past hearing reason. You don't understand. They threatened to expose everything. The embezzlement, the gambling. Your sister, he pointed at Victoria. She promised to help keep it quiet if I dug up dirt on Malik. The pieces clicked into place. Samantha looked at her sister, understanding dawning. You were trying to protect James by destroying Malik? Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly. I was trying to protect you from making a horrible mistake. James needed help, and I needed leverage. It was a perfect solution. Perfect. Marcus laughed bitterly. Man came to me desperate, talking about suicide if he couldn't pay his debts. I played along to get evidence, to protect my brother. Because that's what family does, protects each other. Malik stared at his brother. Years of misunderstanding dissolving. You were trying to help me? You got out, Marcus said simply. Made something of yourself. Couldn't let them take that away from you. The ballroom had become utterly still, social elites and community members alike witnessing the unraveling of carefully constructed facades. Samantha descended from the stage, moving to stand beside Malik. All this time, you were being blackmailed because of me? I was being reminded of who I am, Malik replied. But your sister was wrong. My past doesn't define me. It prepared me. James made a sudden move, perhaps to run, but security finally stepped in, restraining him gently but firmly. In his pocket, they found evidence of his planned insurance fraud, detailed plans that implicated him while clearing Malik and Marcus. Victoria watched her carefully constructed scheme collapse. You don't understand, she said to Samantha. Everything I did was to protect our family name. No, Samantha Riblaid. Everything you did was to protect your idea of what our family should be. But look around, Victoria. This is our family now. She gestured to the room, board members standing alongside community center kids, wealthy donors chatting with local business owners, barriers breaking down in real time. The world is changing, Samantha continued, addressing the entire room now. We can either change with it, learn from each other, grow together, or we can cling to old prejudices and watch everything we value crumble. Malik took her hand publicly for the first time since their separation. Change isn't easy, he said, looking at Marcus. But it's possible. I'm living proof of that. Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. Maybe it's time I followed your example. The room erupted in applause. Not the polite, restrained approval of society events, but genuine, emotional support. Even some of the more conservative board members found themselves moved by the scene. As James was led away by security and Victoria retreated in defeat, Elizabeth Brooks appeared in the doorway. She surveyed the scene, her daughter standing proudly beside Malik, the mixed crowd, the breaking down of barriers she'd spent a lifetime maintaining. For a moment, mother and daughter locked eyes across the room. Then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, Elizabeth Brooks nodded once and walked away. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's where change begins. Samantha turned to Malik, tears in her eyes, but smile bright. Ready to build some bridges? He looked at his brother, then at the diverse crowd before them, and smiled. Together, he said, we'll build them together. The night ended not with scandal, but with hope. The Brooks Foundation would never be the same. It would be better. And in the days that followed, as news of the event spread, others would be inspired to examine their own prejudices, to reach across divides, to believe in the possibility of change. Because sometimes love isn't just about two people finding each other. Sometimes it's about two worlds coming together, about breaking down walls instead of building them, about believing that the human heart has room for understanding, growth, and redemption. It was never going to be an easy path, but as Samantha and Malik looked out at their new extended family, from board members to community center kids, from Marcus to Mrs. Washington, They knew it would be worth every step. The end.